I think we're going to go ahead and get started with the introductions. Good morning, welcome. Thank you for attending the first, what we hope will become annual Saratoga Book Festival. My name is Educator. I'm on the board of the festival. In my day job, I'm the director of the Saratoga Springs Public Library, so I am super excited to have you all here as our first welcome back to indoor, in-person programming at the library since March of 2020. So we're so excited. For us, this is a little bit of a test run to see where we go from here in terms of welcoming people back inside for these kinds of events. We are on a trajectory to maybe start doing this more often after the holiday season is over and the beginning of the new calendar year. So thank you for coming. In addition to thanking our corporate sponsors, whom we hope you will patronize, we'd like to thank the good folks here at the Saratoga Springs Public Library. Can you tell I'm reading from a script? Thank me. I'd like to thank myself. Without the support of the friends of the library, this would not have been possible. For those who have already visited Northshire Books, please be aware that recent titles of authors appearing throughout the festival are available for sale both at the store and here in the library. There's a pop-up bookstore at the back of the new and popular area there. We also have book plates available if you were not able to get a book ahead of the session or Northshire has sold out of the books. You can mark your calendars now. A question that we're getting is, since we just said first annual, will there be additional festivals to come? And the answer is yes. We've already put it on the calendar, so we're thinking optimistically. The second annual book festival, 10/22/22. We thought that was a date that was easy to remember. And we hope to see you again next year. Bring a friend with you then. Maybe you can sit a little bit closer together at that point. And with that business out of the way, please help me welcome and thank our authors whose time and generosity during these really uncertain times contribute to the most to making this festival a great success. With us here today, a family of writers, illustrators, storytellers to discuss Indigenous literature, language, and identity for a discussion of the important role that literature plays in strengthening Native American and deep and authentic connections to the incorporation of Indigenous language and what that provides to the creative process. Here to guide us in this exploration is James Bruchac, who was raised in the Adirondack foothills in the town of Greenfield Center, a member of the Nulhegan Abenaki tribe and eldest son of Abenaki and Adirondack storyteller Joe Bruchac III. James grew up immersed in the natural world, storytelling, and Native culture. Along with James, we have Jesse Bruchac, who is a Native American author and language teacher from the Abenaki tribe. He has dedicated much of his life to studying the Abenaki language and preserving the culture. He created the first Abenaki language website. And Joe Bruchac, who is a highly acclaimed Abenaki children's book author, poet, novelist, and storyteller, as well as a scholar of Native American culture, co-author with Michael Caputo of the best-selling Keepers of the Earth series. Bruchac's poems, articles, and stories have appeared in over 500 publications, from Acknowledgement Notes and American Poetry Review to National Geographic and Parabola. He has authored more than 50 books for adults and children. And with that, it's my pleasure to welcome back to the Saratoga Springs Public Library, Bruchac.
Hello, my friends. It is usually traditional that we begin by bringing people into the circle through a traditional welcoming song, so that's how we're going to start.
Gayawani hey, ayuk yo hey. 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 Yogan de yogan da. Yogan de
One of the things that we want to do today is to point out the role that literature has been playing for a long time for our indigenous communities. And you should know, for example, that among the Abenaki people, publishing books that they have written goes back for hundreds of years. In fact, many people often are unaware of the fact that here in the Northeast, what we call New England, our area here that we call Indakina, which means our land, that people were going to places such as Harvard University very early on. In fact, the first Native American graduate from Harvard was around 1678. So we're talking about a long history of literacy, and our own Abenaki language was codified by the Jesuits more than 300 years ago. So we have a long tradition of being able to read and write in the European languages, but also to do it within our own traditional cultural background, use our own languages to express ourselves in writing as well as speaking. And the things that we have been doing in our family for the last half century, and of course the last 25 years in terms of my kids here, is to use literature as a way of expressing those things that need to be expressed about the continuance of our native traditions and our cultures, but also the lessons that are offered by indigenous culture to the wider world. Lessons that we feel need to be shared and are very important for not just our own survival, but the survival of all life on this earth. And I'm not exaggerating about that. In our traditional cultures, our stories are always used in two ways in particular. One, to entertain. That way people will listen to them. But two, to teach, because the lessons held within the stories may not be obvious at first, but if you absorb that story into your heart and remember it, further down the line, that teaching may be evident to you. In fact, I've had people come up to me and say, 20 years ago I heard this story when I was a kid, and now I understand it. I think that's really important to remember. Of course, the role of literature in general, as this wonderful inaugural festival is attempting to do, is to communicate something more than just words, something more than just ideas, but a connection that we all have to the present, the past, and the future. That great circle which we're all a part of. I wanted to begin by just telling one brief story, not about our writing, but about other people, about one person in particular, about a time. In 1992, I helped put together the first major gathering of Native American writers. More than 300 people were brought to Oklahoma for 4 days at the University of Oklahoma, a gathering called Returning the Gift. One of the people invited to that gathering was a young woman of the Mohegan Nation of Connecticut, named at the time Melissa Fawcett. Her name is now Melissa Tantaquidgeon, and she returned to her old traditional name. And Melissa won one of the competitions we had at that festival, a first book of poetry competition, a first book of plays, and a first book of nonfiction. And she wrote a book called The Lasting of the Mohegans. Her Mohegan Nation indeed has survived. And many of the names in Fenimore Cooper's famous book actually were taken from the Mohegan people, such as Uncas, who was one of the great leaders of the Mohegan Nation. In any event, at that time in 1992, the Mohegans were not a federally recognized Native American nation, but they were in the process of applying for that recognition. And Melissa's book and her recognition at that festival, she told me, and I've been told by others, was one of the major factors that led to their federal recognition. So it was that a book about her people not only told a story, but also connected them to a recognition of their existence that has proven extremely significant for them as a continuing indigenous people. One of the things that we do, the three of us, in addition to being storytellers, is to publish and distribute books by other Native American authors. In fact, I'm honored to say our small press, the Greenfield Review Press, published the first book by a woman named Leslie Silko, a very important Native American poet and author and storyteller. And we have tried in our own way to maintain that connection, not just for ourselves, but for that larger circle of which we're part. Today we're going to talk a little bit about our own work, how authenticity is a very significant thing, because if you read most of the books written by non-Native authors about Native Americans, you will find almost invariably glaring errors. And the reason for this is that very simply, they have not listened to the people they're writing about. As my old dear late friend, Vine Deloria Jr. said in the titles of one of his books, "We talk, you listen." Where all too often, people have not listened, but they have continued talking. Listening, the Creator meant for us to do. For all of us have 2 ears and only 1 mouth. We must listen twice as much as we talk. And with those few introductory words, I think I'll turn it over to my sons to see what they would like to share with you, how in their own journey, attempting to be authentic in what they write about and what they share is important, but also whatever else they'd like to say, and then we'll actually be doing some more music, a little bit of reading, and answering some questions near the end. So I'll turn it over now to my son Jesse, and then after that, my son Jim.
Good to see you, Leonine Mitombas. Thank you to my father and for that opening and the idea of the circle and the continuance. My continuing journey and kind of the return back to material over and over again has been within the language of the Abenaki, which you may hear me say as Abenaki. This is a journey that requires us to return over and over to it. I'm always learning more. I'm always reconnecting with people, and I've been really lucky enough to be put in positions with speakers and to have learned the language from people who learned it from speakers all the way back to pre-contact. And just to give you a little framework about where the language is, luckily, it is one of few Indigenous languages that was written early on by Indigenous people, as my father mentioned. Some of the earliest graduates of Dartmouth College as well were Abenaki, who went on to publish books, which we are now able to turn back to return to, and learn from. And this idea of continually circling back is very important. Really not even circling back, but just continuing around the circle and coming around again is an Indigenous perspective, one that I think can guide us all as writers when we look to creating work and the idea of revising and the idea of looking to others to add to it and coming back to it. Some projects I know we may discuss more are worked on for many, many years. I know some of the research my father has done in some of his books has required a long time, and a dictionary that I'm working on now, we've got about 15,000 words in it now, and it's a collection of work that really began about 300 years ago with Peter Paul Wasokalani, one of those graduates of Dartmouth College, folding in his work as well as the work of Joseph Laurent in 1884, an Abenaki chief, Henry Lauren Masta, and then continuing with the work that I did on a dictionary starting in 1992 with Cecile Wawanolette of the community of Odenak, Quebec. Although most of her life she lived in Troy, New York, when she returned to Odenak, she found very few people speaking the language and decided that as she was still fluent, she wanted to teach it. And it was right around that time, around 1992, when I went up and we joined forces and we began working. All of the material that we gathered, I've included in the dictionary. I worked with her son, Ely Joubert, after her passing at 98 years old in 2006. Her son and I, Ely, worked together for a decade and continued to grow the knowledge of the languages we taught all over New England. And we lost Ely on Indigenous Peoples Day last year. And it was a tremendous blow to the community, but it also helped inspire everyone. It's been an incredible year for returning back to the language, for coming around. During COVID, we moved online, and I've been teaching Zoom classes pretty much every day of the week now, with up to 100 people in our community, all coming around the language and learning, and turning in large part to literature, like this ongoing dictionary, which is now a project that community online, we've digitized the dictionary, realizing this is the way to go, so that one, you can keyword search it in Abenaki or English, but also whenever anything is missing, or there's a typo or something that needs to be changed, we continue to change it. So it's an ongoing community project, which will likely continue to grow for many years, which is exciting. And to bring it back to what my main source of authentic inspiration is, it's in the language itself and in writing and getting an understanding of some of the roots that feed me. There's an analogy within the creation story of many indigenous people for our own Abenaki communities that we come from a tree, an ash tree. And like an ash tree has roots that keep it grounded in the earth the way we should be, we said that there are, and my father can talk further about it, there are 4 major roots in our lives that can really inspire us for our writing as authors, to find those stories that we wish to share. And my brother will talk a little bit about the roots that have nourished him. And I mentioned the roots that have nourished me have come from these places, one of which is something that we as a family share, which is part of our community as Abenaki people. But beyond that, another root we share is this place. We have to say Kitsiuliuni and acknowledge this place, say great thanks to Mohican people. And it's really great to hear that acknowledgement. So we acknowledge it and return back and look at what was here. We all share that. And so I think that the writing and much of this within Abenaki language, writing that draws upon a place as another root that we all now inhabit places, and land acknowledgements are becoming more commonplace, which is wonderful, to acknowledge whose homeland this is, and then to take a step further and find ways to be allies with these people and tell and listen to the stories that still exist in this place. The stories that we're all going to create in the lives that we live are another important root, our journey through our lives, and as I mentioned, that idea of just our specific family stories. And I guess we're up here sharing a bit of that family journey on an individual journey to go right to the language. That's been my source. My number one root is a part of all that. It's been really a part of my journey for 30 years. I've been learning the language. It's part of my family. I heard it as a kid. We had a dog named Henson, and I know that planted a seed. It means wolf. And then a real important truth in just one word that can give you an example, and I'll pass the mic up, is Abenaki. I said it could mean Abenaki. And what does it mean in a language? The root of it is ki, which is earth. But earth, ki, also means unknown or mysterious. So aga kima is to guide. Aga is guide, ki into the unknown, and that's to educate. Aga kima. Al is the way, Alad is the way you guide, Alak Wasak are the stars, those that guide us, literally. Alak Wasak is the word for stars, our guides. And Ki is that which is unknown. It also represents the earth. Perhaps, I've thought a lot about that. Why is the word for earth and the word for unknown? Perhaps it's just that it hasn't come up yet when you plant seeds. They're in the ground still. They need a little more guidance, they need some sunlight, and then eventually they'll come up. That idea of that potential that's there is in the word ki. And we hear that in Abenaki. Omp, though, is the beginning. That ab comes from the word omp. And omp means to go to do something and then return again. To go and come back again. Go and come back again. That's omp. Ombasawan is a fan. Awan is air. Ombasawan makes the air circle around. Makes it literally circle around. Ombasas is a woodpecker. They say that they're running back and forth on the tree, Ombasas. And who is this one, Ombanaki? I say who, because in the Abenaki language, the world is not in any way divided up by gender of he or she. It's divided up gender of who's and what's. Of who is that and what is that. Most things are someone, not something. Where in English, only we are someone. When we speak in English, only people are someone, and we divide that even further into he and she. The world within the Algonquian languages across the continent is divided up into someone's. Who is that tree? I cannot say what is that tree. That would be incorrect grammatical speech. I say, Awani na abazi, who is that tree? And Om Banaki is someone is traveling. Om is to go and come back again. Who is that one? Kizos. Kizos means the day traveler, the sun. And so often Ombanaki is translated as the dawn land, the one place where one goes and returns again. When returning again, that would be dawn, and who's traveling? But the sun is going across the sky, and then Omban, dawn comes. They've gone and returned again. And so just to look at the language and look at that idea of the return in Abenaki, the return to the journey, the opportunity that every day of dawn offers us is a really constant and reoccurring tradition among Abenaki people, that we are here. That song isn't just to greet you. That's an old Abenaki song sung by the 5 nations of Abenaki people, the Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, the Mi'kmaq, the Penobscot, our own Western Abenaki people, to say thank you, to acknowledge that we have a new opportunity, a new day has begun. Dawn has arrived, and one has gone and returned back again. So that circle my father mentioned, see it right in the word Abenaki. You see that idea of each new experience, this gathering of us together, brings us to a place where we have a new beginning. And I think that's a really wonderful teaching, and it's one that can be found by breaking down just one word. And that's been a big source for me, is breaking down a lot more than one word with students and finding a reconnection to this place, to our own families, to our own journeys, to our own ancestry. It's been a really powerful source, and one that has led to much of my writing. So I'll just say conceal uni for that little bit that I wanted to share.
Just one quick thing before I turn it over to Jim. You may have already noticed that we are acknowledging people. It's really important to acknowledge your sources, to say where things come from, to mention their names, such as Eli and Cecile. My own case is people such as Maurice Dennis, but now we lost his little loon, who was an Abenaki elder who lived in Old Forge and also in Odanak. That recognition that we must always acknowledge and thank. One of the most powerful things you can do in life is to say thank you. And thank you is uni, and in a sense that's returning good for the good you've been given. So it's a very powerful thing. I'll turn it over now to Jim.
I'll keep it briefer. I'm glad with question and answer. So my brother mentioned the idea of circle, the idea of the circle, the idea of roots. And for us, growing up, we both were introduced to Native American literature, often within the sound of my dad's typewriter back in the days, going to sleep to the sound of his typewriter, writing down so many different stories, so many things that were yet to come. And speaking of stories, as kids, we really enjoyed, when we were younger, hearing many of the traditional stories my dad would share with us at night before we went to bed. Until we got to our teenage years, where it didn't seem so cool. Our friends didn't have dads that were telling them stories, much less native stories. In fact, at an earlier age, I didn't know of many other native storytellers except for my father. Of course, we would go to festivals and powwows once in a while, and there would be some storytelling, but not anywhere near the amount of storytelling that we see out there nowadays. So we heard these stories, and we definitely enjoyed them. Myself, along with the cautionary tales and monster stories that I sometimes had a little too much fun retelling to my younger brother Jesse. Maybe not always within their original intent. The scaring part was a little more fun for me, sharing it with my brother that was, a few years younger than me. But the animal stories definitely resonated with me probably the most. And what I do with a lot of that learning is now teaching people about the natural world. That's really been my draw, especially with the Abenaki, the animal people, teaching people about their language, the language of the forest, the language of tracks. That's really my main thing that I drew from those roots. But I remember when I was in 7th grade, probably one of the most embarrassing moments of my life up to that point was when my dad was asked to come into my history class to share some of those traditional stories. And I was pretty shy back then, like to keep a low profile in class, and here comes my dad. He brought his drum. So it was bad enough he was going to tell some stories, because once again, my friends weren't hearing stories like that. He started out with a drum song, and I remember I was so embarrassed, no one else does this stuff really. And it's funny because the kids, they actually like the song, they definitely like the story, but I swore on that day, after being embarrassed in that way, that I would never share any of those stories, sing any of those songs. Of course, that circle, things have a way of coming back around. And for me, it was really the skills that also brought me back to the ideas of, wow, a broader audience wants to hear those stories, wants to actually hear those songs. And our parents afforded us certain opportunities throughout our lives. They never really pushed us per se, but opportunities happened. And sometimes those opportunities brought us back to those roots a little bit more, whether it be sending me off when I was 12 years old to camp in Maine for 8 weeks on an island with no running water or electricity, and I did survive. I thought that was the original intent, but it wasn't. To connecting us with John Stokes, who was a non-native who had actually spent a lot of time with the Aborigines in Australia and came back to the Americas and was traveling and visiting various indigenous communities trying to get youth reconnected to their traditional cultures, and was part of a gathering at Onchiota, the Six Nations Indian Museum in Onchiota, and run by Ray Fadden, the Fadden family, very important to our family. And it was a gathering of Native peoples and some youth, and John kind of rekindled that idea, teaching some of the survival skills, tracking, and bringing in storytelling. He brought in some of the Aboriginal tales and others he had learned while traveling around the country. And that made this stuff seem cool again. Some of the things I had already been learning, I learned some new things, and that kind of lit a spark in me that, well, at least the skills are cool. The stories are okay, they kind of go along with it. I was in my mid-teenage years then. But eventually, I began to travel and work with people such as John, started to teach the skills, and sitting around a campfire, people would often ask, knowing my dad, by then he was well known as a storyteller in my late teens, whether I told any of those stories he told. And I eventually caved and started telling stories and found out not only did I remember many of those stories I had heard, I actually wasn't too bad at sharing those stories. And it got to the point where eventually I was sharing more stories than I was in some cases teaching the skills. And nowadays it's kind of balanced out. It's a balance of both sharing stories and teaching various skills. And along the way, forming a place called Abenaki, named after this land out in the Greenfield Center, where we share stories, where we teach people of all ages about the natural world. We share the language both in person, and of course my brother's online teachings are all through the Abenaki Education Center. And of course we put on the Saratoga Native American Festival, hopefully returning next year. We took another year off just because of the unknowns and grant deadlines and not knowing how we were going to run it. So we hopefully will be returning next year with our Saratoga Native American Festival. And that idea of that circle and the expanding circle, my dad talking about returning the gift, and that idea of bringing people together. And Saratoga, of course, traditionally has always been a gathering place of Native peoples, and then many peoples gathered in this place. So ideas of bringing people together for learning, whether it be in person or online, like with my brother's courses, and of course all of us are Zooming a lot more than we used to 2 years ago, so, but also at the same time reaching broader audiences when we're online. And of course the festival affording an opportunity to bring in many Native peoples from these regions back to this area to share with the broader public. So for me, stories, of course, all of the various cultural aspects, and very excited, always have been, about the natural world and teaching about that, which also brought me back full circle as well to kind of appreciate the whole big picture. So that's a little bit about me.
I did a land acknowledgement in the beginning of the festival last night, but I should remind you all that this area has been traditional Mohegan land for over 10,000 years. So we are very new here on this land, those of us who may not have those indigenous connections, but people are always being welcome. The word kulipayo means you are welcome here. And it was spoken and will be spoken many times again in the future. I wanted to just give you a sense of what the language sounds like beyond what we've just been saying. So Jesse and I actually have done a book which is a bilingual collection of stories in the form of poems. Short poems in English and the Abenaki language. So what we'll do is just share one of those with you.
And I think we'll do it without the microphone just because it's hard to pass this thing back and forth like that. And you can hear a little bit. And also, I think if you take a look at this, you'll see the language is really beautiful. It has that kind of musicality to it, which was remarked upon by the Jesuits and other people who were really on through Algonquin languages and said how much they remind them of the sound of the wind, the songs of the birds, the sounds of nature, which of course we have to acknowledge because they're our first teachers.
So that acknowledgement can go beyond, I think that's a big step, and I think we see authors do that, but we can acknowledge those things beyond our human relations more easily perhaps in Algonquian context when we look at all of these who's, I mentioned all of these someones. We can learn from someone who is a tree, we can learn from someone who is the sun. It's a lot easier to say I'm learning from someone when we give animacy, agency to the world, and the idea of giving agency to things like the wind is nothing new to an Indigenous storyteller. In fact, we see that animals talk, and we see all these things happening in traditional storytelling contexts, and that enables the lesson to be told in a better way. And I think this poem illustrates a little bit of that when we talk about inspiration from the natural world. In my home, Pomosas Biwinia Zonka Kapiwi.
My grandfather walks with me through the forest.
Tiga mahom Pomosas Biwinia Onda Insadzi Mama Siu.
When grandfather walks with me, I'm not afraid.
In my home, the Mont Baganagon Dakmont Wiwi.
Grandfather leads me up the hill.
Wadzo Pazondi Pita no Paiwi.
From the hill, I see a long, long way.
In my home, Gigi Mondwa Linton Ganudzi Nia.
Grandfather whispers a song to me.
Linton Gan Linto Zi Mina. Ta Mina.
It is a song I will sing again and again.
In my home, Onda Kizi Udao no Paiwi.
Grandfather is never far away.
In my home, Ao Alom Sek.
My grandfather is the wind. So as Jesse was saying, you can see that. Jesse has himself now written several books, all of them bilingual. And Jim and I have now done, I think it's 7 books together, all of which are either traditional stories or retellings or using those stories. For example, a book called Native American Games and Stories, where games were also important in teaching. Jim is the author of a number of books of his own, working on a couple of books now. And Jesse, as he has pointed out to you, has been continuing to work intensively with the language. I thought before going further, I wanted to remind you that this is not just us talking at you, but it is us sharing with you. So if anyone has any questions right now, that question or any questions that might take in whatever direction, we'd be happy to hear them. And in sign language, which is used throughout the North American continent, for example, you say you're happy, you say the sun is in my heart. Really beautiful. Languages of all kinds teach us new things. And to say you have a question, just do this. So, yes.
Yeah, I have a question. Would you mind, or everybody else, I would like you to read this whole poem by yourself without translation to hear the melodic element in the language, if it's okay.
I could just speak a little something different too,
Okay.
if you'd like. Yeah, I mean, I think the melody of the language is extremely important, the intonation of the language. You can hear it really easily illustrated, the intonation of words. When I say Abenaki, I'm speaking the language with an English accent. It's got a stress on the second to the last syllable. If I were speaking in the language, I'd say it Abenaki, where it's a 3-2-1, Abenaki, Abenaki, and the last syllable is always stressed and there's a pitch raise. so that you know that one word has ended and another word is about to begin. There are no words in Abenaki. The idea of a word is actually, it's a holiophrasis language, so each what we would consider word are entire sentences. So if I were to say, somebody, some kigaruigwa home, some kigaruigwa home, the end is a home, that means the word's over. Some kigaruigwa home means, and they came rolling down the hill. It's one word. So they're very, very big words. This is the beginning of, if I were about to tell stories with you, someone may say, you can hear that rhythmic pattern and hear that 3, 2, 1. Ma home, grandfather. Ma home no ga ka no wa, ma milgi pongzo ba nik, song hipo zit. Awon si sweetie zik, sonko sa ondo ka wondik. Long ago, our grandfathers told us stories of many wonderful things, especially those stories were told to the children. Awon si sweetie zik. In awon si samak, in wadzo no niswak, in awon si samak, nia indos, Carolyn, agama wadzo nem, pili gadmat, olongwa, agama niquidons kason gadma. I have my daughter, I have 2 kids. My daughter turned 16 yesterday. Carolyn. Yeah, and Mongis got agama papi, babaswahamwagan, shenekahoa. She's playing volleyball today. Nian wazonem namun. I have my son in Dawon Sisam, Jacob, and Jacob agama ukazaldam in babaswahamwagan ansi. He's a big fan of football. Both of them, Niswak and Dawon Sisam Kizi Kluzi Amwagan. Both of my kids speak the language really well, which I'm very proud of. I'll give you a little more chance to hear that.
Did the Jesuits accurately translate your language, or did they put their own tilt on it?
They actually, the funny thing is, yes, they did put their own tilt on it, but they also put an Abenaki tilt on things because they had to turn to Abenaki people for translations, and some things are lost in translation. So some funny things happened in translations where things like a certain type of fish is called, there's one type of fish that it was labeled as a fish rack fish, and you can imagine maybe somebody said, what is that? And they said, that's a fish rack. It wasn't the actual type of fish. It was the place the fish was located. A more, kind of a cultural context is we have a waso spemi, which literally means extreme unction. If you're reading about extreme unction, it's translated as bear grease. So extreme unction, if you're familiar with the sacred rite that's given before death, it was important and bear grease is important. So the translator said, oh, an important oil, well, it must be bear grease. So you see awaso spemi as the translation there. Our Father who art in heaven, whose name is hallowed like that of a great sky chief. Songumon, or Sagamore, is a chief. Song, one who stands in peace. Song is to stand peacefully, and that's the name for a chief. One who can stand tall and strong and hold a peaceful center, basically, is Songumon. The Lord's Prayer. And that's from the Lord's Prayer. So the idea that that was snuck in place of Jesus is really beautiful.
Yeah, do you get any support at the state level? I mean, I would love to see signs in the local area with your, the language of what it was originally.
I could say one thing, and I would just will add another, but that is that our travel enrollment is in Vermont.
Oh, okay.
And Vermont has 4 state-recognized tribal nations right now. And the state of Vermont is doing a great deal now to acknowledge our people.
Right.
For example, we have opened the legislature in the state of Vermont a couple of times with an opening in both Abenaki and English.
Mm-hmm.
And so in Vermont, a lot of that is happening.
Good.
Not so much in New York, because quite frankly, what occurred in New York State is that I blame or credit Arthur C. Parker, who was of Seneca descent on his father's side and thus not able to call himself Seneca because it's all matrilineal. But he was a state anthropologist, archaeologist, and he was very much a Haudenosaunee or Iroquois nationalist. So everything Algonquin got written out by Arthur C. Parker in the early part of the 20th century. Ironically, his wife was Abenaki. So we are really trying to reawaken the awareness, and so too my sister Marge, who was the head of Native Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, recently wrote a book called Savage Kin, which won the award for the best anthropological book of a year ago, and it talks about the relationship between ethnologists and indigenous people. And you can guess who the savage kin are. It ain't us. And the way people have rewritten our histories and our cultures from a Western point of view. So again, a lot can be done in Acknowledgement just here in Saratoga Springs alone, which is such an important Native history.
Yes.
Yeah, in Vermont, we have, the State House has passed an initiative, it's a law that we will be changing, and I'm working on that. All of the state-owned lands will have Abenaki names, properly researched and signage. So that would be wonderful to have that in New York. A land acknowledgement, again, is a beginning. If we're acknowledging this as Mohican land, then the question is going to come, the key, the mystery is, where are the Mohican people? And Sean Stevens is a language keeper of the Mohican, the Stockbridge Munsee Mohican now in Wisconsin, are returning to their homes here and are getting land back, and different things are happening in our region. And Mohican people are working in their own language revitalization efforts, and part of that connection being made and bringing their voices back to the table, as my father said, recognizing that it's not only a history of the Mohawk people in this region, but we also need to have Mohican voices. Just to the west of us, it is certainly where we see Mohawk signage, and we do see some of it. We can't escape it. There are many place names around us. We see Kanajahalega, Kanajahari. We see the language there. We see just to the north of us, it is Abenaki speaking. Just north of Lake George was Abenaki. That's really the dividing line. Such as from Lake George north, Bitawabago is Lake George, but it's also called Orakan, which is Mohican. Oligan is, I'd say Hooligan, that means it's good water.
Yes.
So there's a real crossing in Saratoga. It is Mohican. Just to the north, we have the Abenaki language, and then just to the west, we have the Mohawk language. I think it's really important, and it's worth its beginning, and the beginning of it is recognizing whose home we're on, and then having those voices more involved in everything in this place to bring it back, and that we can connect more closely with it through words is absolutely true, through names.
Also, if you look at the Mohegan and Abenaki language they're all Algonquin languages. And the Mohawks are allied with the Mohegans, right? But this was their land. And then eventually the Mohawks they were more powerful, took control of this area from the Mohican, but there was an allegiance too. So that's where the confusion comes in. They were allies with one another, right? But a different culture.
Because of really location, geographical location, where many people allied more with the French during the French and Indian War. The Mohegans were, of course, known to be scouts with Project Rangers and all that kind of stuff, and worked with the Mohawks during many of those endeavors, but the Mohawks were, in the end, more powerful. So kind of, and various land exchanges and stuff, they were both on those, but it was a little more oriented towards the Mohawks. They had a little more power. So this traditionally was shared area when they come to the springs, right? But it was Mohegan land originally.
As I understand, originally after the Revolutionary War, there was talk of renaming Lake George Horicon and close enough, yeah. But that it never happened, because it was the name of a British king and we had sent them packing, I guess. But I kind of wish that had happened, especially in the Lake George area. Your only tribute is the name of the boat.
Right, it's still there, yeah.
Yeah.
So culturally, Abenaki can be very, very close culturally. Haudenosaunee culture is different, coming more from out west within the last several thousand years, a Siouxsian-based language originally. But of course, very embedded in the Northeast within the last several thousand years. But Algonquian cultures, and this is, archaeologically proven, have been here for a long, thousands and thousands and thousands of years.
Almost mutually intelligible. I can understand a great deal of Mohican. Algonquian languages are a linguistic continuum, so each one running into one another, like circles, we can understand each other, but if you're to jump and go far enough geographically, like in Europe, with Indo-European languages, they become quite diverse. But Mohican is one of our closest neighbors, so very easy, and a lot of intermarriage between Abenaki and Mohican and Mohawk. We're all closely related down there.
Yeah, our own genealogy go far enough back. We actually have Mohawk and Mohegan as part of our own genetic heritage, so to speak. I should point out also that we work very closely with all of these different nations. For example, Tom Porter, Sakopaniopas, the one who wins, is the head of the Acknowledgement community, which is along the Mohawk River near what is now called Kanatahari. Acknowledgement place in Clean Pond. And Tom has always been, what is at our Saratoga Native Festival, and done the traditional opening for us. So this is a gathering place in many ways. What we try to do with our work, with our publishing, with our language, with our writing, is to acknowledge those connections. And each time I've written a book that's not about my particular nation, for example, this novel called Talking Leaves, which is about Sequoia, the one who codified and created a writing system for the Cherokee language. I worked very closely with the Cherokee language program in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, who read everything I wrote before it was published, worked with me on the language, and made sure that I had done things properly. And I think that's one thing that we all need to remember. When we deal with someone else's culture, don't make assumptions. Don't assume you know what you're talking about. You may know, but you may not know enough. And of the more than 170 books I've now had published, I would say about a third of them are ones I've done with close cooperation of people in different tribal communities. That's very important for us to remember. And as a matter of fact, part of our ancestry is Slovak. And I wrote a book called Dragon Castle, which takes place in medieval Slovakia. I worked with Slovak speakers, Slovak language teachers, and people who knew the culture much better than I did. So whatever our cultural background is, remember, we have our own roots, as Jesse said. We have 4 roots. We have ancestry. We have family. We have place. And we have personal experience. And each of those roots are very significant. And we need to delve deeply into them to be able to have a tree that is strongly based and is not missing and likely to fall over because one of those roots is lacking. Other questions?
Can I stand up? I have more of a comment than a question. I've been fortunate. I was able to retire from the state of New York. I have a place in Savannah, Georgia. Savannah has the Savannah Book Festival, which is, you may have heard of it, it's one of the best in the country. There's notables there like Algoa, Portacapi, a lot of different people, a lot of different persuasions. And I think this is important. I hope this grows to perhaps be a little bit, larger and more encompassing of people in the community. But I have a question for you because I saw dozens and dozens of authors in 7 or 8 years that have attended that festival. And there was one about moderator was talking about the Indians and about what this country has done as far as the Indians are concerned. I know this is probably a little bit cutting edge here, but I guess my question is, what he told me, and I didn't buy it, was that is because the majority basically rules. I mean, and I'm a former lawyer, so I know that's the case. But the problem is the majority has to take account of the minorities too. And I guess my question is that it's very difficult to get through the resentment of what's happened through the history of African Americans. That's what comes to mind most of the time. Obviously African Americans, but Native Americans. How do you get through that resentment? I know this is, like I say, a very philosophical question, but it's something that I'm interested in, and I was wondering if you can let us know.
Yeah, I think having an opportunity to have one's voice heard, to see your community reflected in the larger community where it may have been marginalized, are 2 beginning places, and I think we began here today. today. And having a seat here, it's really wonderful to be included in this, to have an opportunity to share the process of where literature comes from. And in many cases, it comes from those places of past wrongs and resentments and things that we may be working through on a personal level within our family, within great experiences of our communities that they've been through, of our ancestry. So certainly literature is one way in which we as a community of people can all engage with one another and get to better understand each other. And those understandings of what's unknown about each other can lead to healing. And that healing's got to happen within the Native community, it's got to happen within the African American community, it's got to happen within every community that makes up our larger community. So what a, like you said, what a wonderful, like in Savannah and other places, that a book festival, celebrating literature is a venue for that kind of healing to begin. I believe it is, and I certainly don't have all the answers, but I do know that in my own reaching into the language, I've found a lot of beauty there, and I've been able to share it with other people in a way that helps me to engage with them and better understand one another in my world. So that's something that I've found.
Thank you.
Two things. First of all, remember, we're not speaking for everyone. We're speaking for us and our smaller community. And there may be generalizations that come in here, but don't imagine that any one Indigenous person, or for that matter, any one African American or Asian American person speaks for the entire community. One of the mistakes that's been made by majority culture is to pick spokesmen, usually men, who are the representatives and supposedly stand for everything. And that's a huge mistake. Within traditional cultures, we believe it's a circle, and everyone should have a chance to speak in that circle. And it used to drive Europeans crazy when they tried to have a treaty-making event, and everybody who was in the Indigenous community would speak. They'd stand up and say, well, what my sister or what my brother just said was this. And what I have to say is this. And then they'd sit down the next, what my brother and my sister and my uncle, they all have to say this, summarize it. Now this is what I have to say. So we keep going on and on and on and on. But it's important that it does go on and on and on. Now we need patience. And that question of resentment and anger, which is very, very deep in a lot of places. I have a very dear friend who's a traditional Cheyenne person. He's a striped arrow people. His name is Henson. He's a poet and a storyteller. And Lance gave me a piece of wisdom years ago. He said, if you have a cup of water, that water has gone bad and you can no longer drink it, what do you do with it? Carry it around with you everywhere? No. You pour it out and get fresh water. And that cup could be full of guilt, which we don't want to lay on you. We don't want to make people, it could be full of resentment, could be full of anger. And quite frankly, thinking of American Indian Sign Language, this is the sign for anger. Your mind is twisting back on itself as opposed to thought that rises up to the Creator. So I think that's important for us to remember in relation to that question of yours.
Yeah, one thing that we kind of decided, or I guess in a way my dad also proved as an example for us, was we've always been gap bridgers. We would try to communicate and talk to people, also being of mixed ancestry as well. We have those connections, the bridges between communities, so we've always been erred more on the side of educating people in a positive way. And some people, there's many ways of doing things. Guilting people works too, and I'm not even going to say that's wrong. That's just another way of going about it, okay? And the other way is to inspire people to want to find some of the harder truths out themselves, as well as not to try to make the people in front of us feel guilty, but open their minds to look and explore and try to find things out for themselves as well. Don't just take our word for things, look into it. And just like example of histories of this area, there are things that were distorted, but we are also, we may say, it wasn't originally Mohawk land, but we're good friends with the Mohawks. So it's like, but there are truths too. So I mean, people should look into those truths as well on their own. We'll plant some seeds, give our perspective on things, but then hopefully inspire people to look into things deeper themselves. And, you know, just in one tribal community alone, if you talk to like 6 different elders, you might get 6 different answers.
That's okay.
Yeah, exactly. You know, so it's like one, you know, we don't all share exactly the same views on every single thing too, within a family. You know, that's just being human. No one person can speak for everyone, even within their own family, within their own community. So more voices, the better.
I know the most.
Hey, that's true. At least about one of James Bruchac, the Scats and Tracks of the Northeast and the Balkan Guide series. This is an internationally known book about animal tracking. And you find, even with animal tracking, people get it wrong. You see people who describe a bear's footprint as being like a human footprint, except it's not, because the bear's big toe is on the opposite side. And I think that, again, listening to your elders, listening to many voices, and that's what the book festival does. You have many voices to hear here.
First of all, it's good to see you guys again. And I know you're running out of time. The library's been doing this month's program on just topics and discussions on Native Americans. So we've been having a conversation every month, correction, every week, in regards to specific topics. The last topic that we dealt with this past Thursday was on the experience of the boarding schools for Indigenous people. And one of the questions that came up, or what we found ourselves discussing further, was in the United States there are only 32 tribal colleges. And in New York State there are no tribal colleges. What is your opinion on tribal colleges?
I'm engaging a bit right now through Middlebury. We're working with tribal colleges. I mentioned I'm the director of a new program. It's no longer a pilot status, a school of Abenaki among the Middlebury language schools. We've been added as the 12th language in Vermont. It's tremendous, and it's a tremendous opportunity. And we are engaging with tribal colleges around the country to offer people opportunities within Indigenous language to continue their education. It is a really problematic history, the education of Native people. It's become a very, finally, it's come out of that Aki, that hidden place where it's been, and there's light shining upon what I have heard throughout my life, and I'm going to be 50 soon, but I've heard it. Still see in my lifetime, it was a secret, you know, that there were all of these terrible who were murdered at the hands of their educators. And this is a history that's just beginning to be told, and it's one that there will be literature about, and there's continuing engagement, and we need to just continue to demand. It just opened up the ability at a couple of the churches of Akwesasne, where we have friends, Mohawk friends, to do some examining and some digging and finding it out. And I remember hearing as a kid, you know, people saying about kids who disappeared and things that had happened. Native people had no choice, even up until almost the year 2000 in the state of Maine, to raise their own children. Federally recognized tribes had children at 6 years old taken away from them to be educated because they were seen as not fit parents. This is a really recent, there are many people involved in this who went through this very recently, who went through these boarding school experiences, and it continues. There are still boarding schools, so it's not, and it's not all bad. A lot of it's bad. I have friends who say it was good for them, Indigenous people, elders, who say, no, it would work out for me, but I know it didn't for everyone. It's terrible, and many lives were lost in that experience.
And tribal colleges is a whole other.
It is.
There aren't any in New York State.
Yeah, tribal colleges have to come from the tribal nations themselves.
Yeah.
That's the thing. So for us to work on trying to impose the structure of a tribal college without it coming first from within the community. And I think that it could happen, and should happen. And who knows what will happen. We will support it, but we're certainly not going to say this is how it has to be done. And it's also important to remember that when you talk about education, is it drawing out, which is the Greek root of the word, educare, or is it pounding in, which is the way it's been done often in Western culture. And our traditional education is self-discovery and learning through experience. who know how to do things are the ones who inspire the things being done properly, as opposed to someone saying, here's your curriculum, this is what you have to recognize, remember, and then pair it back to me. So that's really important and significant. So education is complicated and very important, and we do whatever we can to support it in our way, to do as much traditional style education as we can, and that's all we can do. Thank you very much for that question, Kendall. I know we've gone over just a little bit, we started a little late, so I think we should probably just take maybe one more question.
I think one more, so that there's an opportunity for both sides.
Yeah. So one final question, if anyone has one, please feel free to ask. If not, then we'll just do a little closing.
Well, we opened with the drum, so I'll finish with the drum song, and hope you all have a great day. My brother and I will be available at 11:30 for some children's storytelling here in the library together, which I look forward to. Right after this, there's a book signing for all of us right outside as well, so some more questions can happen there. This is a song that comes from one of the 5 Abenaki nations. It was originally Maliseet, although it's sung by all of our people now, to give thanks for all of the gifts that we have, those things that we, especially at this time of year, are going to be thankful for, the harvest. And so I'll just share those with you and say, Kitsiluni, thank you for your time and your questions. Hey go, hey gane.